Well, thank you for the invitation to participate in the panel. It's my job to represent the entire federal government, which I am both honored and frightened to try to do. Actually, what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of a feel for the space that the Department of Interior and specifically the U.S. Geological Survey lives in within this knowledge ecosystem that we're talking about. So by way of introduction into federal government publishing and science, I'll give you a view in through one particular window. Like Ed, I actually have spent my entire career in academics, having done a PhD and then went into academics at a university and did the publish-or-perish thing for a while, then ran a professional society for a decade, and then joined the government, still in science agencies. So I've seen it from multiple angles, and what strikes me is that how little people appreciate and understand the depth and breadth of the science that's actually conducted within the federal government and some of the challenges that we face that perhaps are nuanced challenges that you all face. It's slightly different, the sorts of things that we have to wrangle. So hopefully I'll give you a little bit of a feel for some of those over just the next few minutes. So by way of introduction to the Department of Interior, just real quickly, in case you all are unaware, Department of Interior is one of the federal agencies that is a cabinet-level agency. Our secretary is responsible for 10 different bureaus, over 70,000 employees, more than 10,000 scientists, scholars, and science support staff. And this includes the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. The last two are all offshore outer continental shelf regulators. The Bureau of Reclamation, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Office of Surface Mining, and the U.S. Geological Survey. So it is a giant and very diverse group of organizations and mandates and missions that are represented by a single federal agency. So just real quickly, so you have an understanding for what I mean by this depth and breadth. We're talking about an agency that's responsible for managing 20% of the land mass of the United States on behalf of the on behalf of the citizens of the United States. In addition to that, this same agency is responsible for 1.6 billion acres of the outer continental shelf, which is larger than the continental United States by itself. This is all of that land that starts at the coastline and goes out to about 200 miles around all the United States and its protectorates. So that is an enormous responsibility in and of itself, without even mentioning the fact that we are the largest water supplier to the 17 western states, and we're responsible for migratory birds, endangered species, and a whole suite of other things. Largely, the decisions made about these various lands, resources, and equities that the American people own, the decisions need to be based, at least in part, on science. But now let's not delude ourselves into believing that decisions are entirely based on science, because we know that there are at least 3 pillars on which decisions sit, and that would be science, which is always welcome at the table of decision-making at Department of Interior, as well as the best, long-term best interests of the American people. Now, what are those long-term best interests of the American people, you might ask? Well, as you probably can appreciate, that can change over time, depending on who is representing the long-term best interests of the American people. And finally, fidelity to the law. So those 3 things absolutely must be part of decisions that are made on behalf of managing land and resources for the American people. And those are the 3 pillars that Department of Interior can speak to readily. But beyond the resources, we're also responsible for the over 550 federally recognized tribal entities within the United States. And that is a tremendous responsibility in and of itself. So ultimately, the idea here is that high-quality science and scholarship play an important role in decision-making across all of these resources and responsibilities. And so I'm going to talk briefly about, oh, and by the way, Department of Interior, when it was first started, was the Department of Home. Luckily, somebody realized that that was not going to be a PR blockbuster, so they came up with Department of Interior, which is not much better, but there you go. So how big is DOI in terms of dollars and science? Well, if we think about what OMB calls science, which is strictly the research and development dollars, which is a subset of all the science that Department of Interior does, we're talking about an $800 million R&D budget at Department of Interior. Well, so how big is that relative to all of Interior? Well, we're talking about a $20 billion enterprise, Department of Interior. And here's the interesting thing. Department of Interior brings in $15 billion per year into the federal treasury. That's the number 2 source of revenue in the United States federal treasury behind the American taxpayer. So these are oil leases and revenues from oil, from mining, and from all other kinds of activities that go on in multiple use environments that we manage. So let's talk about the science for a second. More than 82% of that R&D budget is allocated to the U.S. Geological Survey. And so I'm going to focus in on that piece because that's really the piece that represents the majority of what goes on, but also is what I'm most familiar with at this particular moment. I mentioned that R&D is just a piece of the budget. Monitoring, ongoing observations, and any kind of management activities out on the landscape that are science-based or can yield to scientific discovery or results are actually not included in R&D budgets. That is in a different bucket according to the Office of Management Budget. So the actual budget of science at Interior would be probably twice or more what the R&D budget is. So, what about USGS? Founded in 1879. One of the important things to understand about the U.S. Geological Survey is that we are fundamentally different than NIH or NSF. We have an intramural science effort. We do not give grants. We are happy to receive them, however. And we do science with what effectively is a very large university embedded right in the federal government. About $1 billion is appropriated for the U.S. Geological Survey. And several $100 million beyond that are part of our budget as a result of reimbursable dollars. People contract with us to do work for them, states, for example. We have over 3,000 researchers at the U.S. Geological Survey, which makes us the same or a little bigger than Penn State, and we are just a little bit older than Stanford University. So we actually represent one of the major research efforts in the United States. Some of our more well-known projects or activities that you all may be familiar with, even though you may not associate them with the U.S. Geological Survey, for example, geological maps, quadrangles, for those of you that hike. That's all us. Landsat. We manage the Landsat satellites and all of the imagery that comes from there. Volcano monitoring. Anytime the FAA has to shut down or reroute planes because of volcanic ash, that would be because of U.S. Geological Survey monitoring volcanoes throughout the world. Earthquake monitoring, same thing. Earthquake.usgs.gov will give you every earthquake on the planet at any given moment and going back for several decades, actually many, many decades. We also are able to detect nuclear tests, in some cases undocumented nuclear tests that we let the State Department know about when we see these things happen. Tsunami monitoring, also part of our repertoire there. And, of course, scientific support for endangered species management, land management, et cetera, et cetera. So, what part of the knowledge ecosystem do we represent? Well, obviously the geosciences, but also the water-related sciences and biological sciences are a big part of what we work with. We have an internal publishing group called the Science Publishing Network. We have multiple series within our publications that represent the equivalent of different journals. We have a rigorous internal peer review system that no publication goes out of the USGS doors, either internally published or externally published, unless it has been through this rigorous peer review process. Over 50,000 scholarly publications from our internal publication network are available at usgs.gov right now, and more than 41,000 scholarly publications authored by USGS authors are out there in your journals and journals that your competitors represent. We're running right now at about 7,000 publications per year. About half of that is internal, half of that is external. So that's roughly 2 publications per year, or a little more than that, for every single researcher at USGS. So this is the space we operate in, and this is who we represent as part of the federal family. There are other entities that have intramural scientific efforts, but we are one of the largest in the federal government. So I will leave it at that, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions to answer. Thank you.